It started like any other lazy Sunday afternoon, with sunlight spilling through the kitchen window and the faint hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence. I had just finished toasting some bread and layering it with slices of turkey, a bit of lettuce, and the last spoon of mustard left in the jar. It wasn't much, but for me it was a small comfort. A moment of peace in a house that used to feel like home. I sat at the counter, holding the plate, when the front door burst open. My son Luke's voice echoed down the hallway, loud and careless, followed by laughter and the heavy steps of his friends. There must have been 10 of them, all grown men in their late 20s, smelling of cologne and beer, talking over each other like a pack of excited kids. Before I could say a word, they flooded into my kitchen as if it belonged to them. Luke barely looked at me when he opened the fridge, grabbing cans of soda and tossing them to his friends. Someone turned on music from their phone, a loud beat that vibrated through the cabinets. I tried to smile. I tried to tell myself it was fine, that boys would be boys. But I wasn't sure when my son had stopped seeing me as his mother and started treating me as a background character in his life. I turned back to my sandwich, ready to take a bite, when Luke's hand reached over my shoulder and snatched it from the plate. He laughed, calling out that it looked good and that they could all share APASABOs. I felt my cheeks burn as his friends chuckled, some filming the moment on their phones. My voice trembled when I told him to stop fooling around, that it was mine. But he just smiled, saying I could always make another one. It was such a small thing, a sandwich, but it carried years of quiet exhaustion behind it. I tried to take it back, not because I was hungry, but because I couldn't stand one more moment of being invisible in my own house. He held it out of reach, teasing like he used to when he was 10. Only this time, it wasn't playful. One of his friends made a comment about me needing to relax, and another joked that I was acting dramatic. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. The smell of mustard, the sticky counter, the mocking laughter, it all blurred together until I felt something inside me snap. I told Luke firmly to stop, to respect me. He rolled his eyes and shoved my shoulder lightly, but it wasn't light enough. My back hit the edge of the counter, and I stumbled. The room fell silent for a second, the music still thumping in the background. I saw the sandwich fall to the floor, half smashed, the bread sticking to the tile. Pain shot up my arm, but worse than that was the look on my son's face, half guilt, half annoyance. He reached toward me, mumbling that I was fine, that it was just an accident. His friends laughed nervously, unsure what to do. One of them picked up the ruined sandwich and tossed it in the trash as if nothing had happened. I stood there, gripping the counter for balance, trying to steady my breath. 5 years ago, I would have cleaned the mess and pretended it didn't matter. But not this time. Something inside me had changed. I looked at Luke and his friends standing in my kitchen, beer cans in hand, waiting for me to calm down so they could keep their fun going. Instead, I straightened my back, wiped my palms on my jeans, and said the words that stopped them cold. "Perfect," I said quietly. "I am calling the police." The room froze, and for the first time, my son realized his mother was done being silent. The moment the words left my mouth, Luke's smile vanished. His friends exchanged uncertain looks, shifting uncomfortably, as if the air had turned heavier. I could see the disbelief in my son's eyes. He never thought I would stand up to him. Never imagined that the woman who once stayed quiet through every insult and mess would draw a line that sharp. One of the guys muttered that I was overreacting. Another tried to calm things down, saying it was all just a misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. My shoulder ached where I had hit the counter, and my dignity stung even more. I walked past them toward the phone on the wall, each step steady, deliberate. My hands were trembling, but my decision was not. Luke grabbed my wrist, his voice low and urgent, telling me to stop, to think about what I was doing. For years, I had been told to calm down, to keep the peace, to not embarrass anyone. That afternoon, peace was no longer my duty. He let go when I looked at him. Not angry, but utterly disappointed. That expression seemed to scare him more than shouting ever could. I dialed the number, my fingers cold against the buttons. The dispatcher answered, and for a second, I almost hung up. But then I saw my reflection in the glass cabinet, the tired lines on my face. The woman who had become everyone's servant but her own, and I spoke. My voice was steady. As I explained, there had been an incident at my address. I could hear the rustling behind me, the whispered panic as Luke's friends realized I wasn't bluffing. When the police confirmed a unit would be sent, I thanked them politely and hung up. Silence fell again, broken only by the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Luke sat down heavily on a stool, running a hand through his hair. One of his friends swore under his breath. Another muttered something about leaving before things got messy. I stood still, feeling the weight of years lifting, one breath at a time. When the knock came on the door, I didn't flinch. 2 officers stepped in, professional and calm. I explained what had happened as clearly as I could, keeping my tone even, my words precise. They took notes, asked questions, and looked at the bruise already forming on my shoulder. Luke kept insisting it was an accident, that no one meant any harm. One of the officers nodded, saying it would all be included in the report. They didn't arrest anyone, but they made it clear this was being documented as a potential assault. That word hung in the air, assault. It made Luke's face pale, and I could see the shame creeping in as his friends began to fidget, unsure whether to apologize or slip away quietly. I thanked the officers for coming, and when they left, I closed the door behind them slowly, savoring the sound of it latching shut. For the first time in years, I felt control returning to me, like a light slowly filling a long dark room. Luke mumbled that I had embarrassed him, that everyone would think he was some kind of monster. I told him softly that he had done that to himself, not me. He stood there, silent, his friends avoiding my eyes as they gathered their things. One by one, they left, muttering awkward goodbyes that never reached me. When the house was finally quiet again, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cracked plates still on the floor. It was strange, my body ached, but my spirit felt lighter. I picked up the broken pieces carefully, washed my hands, and made another sandwich. This time, no one took it from me. I ate in silence, tasting not mustard and bread, but a small, quiet freedom that had been missing for far too long. Yet deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Something in Luke's eyes before he walked out told me this confrontation had only just begun. That night, the house felt emptier than ever. The echoes of laughter and loud music were gone, replaced by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the sound of the wind brushing against the windows. I sat in the living room, a blanket over my shoulders, watching the glow of the porch light flicker through the curtains. My body still ached, but it was the silence that hurt most. For years, I had dreamed of peace in this house. But not this kind of peace, the kind that feels like loss. I thought about Luke. About how the little boy who used to bring me wildflowers from the yard had turned into a man who saw me as a burden. Somewhere along the way, I had let love turn into fear. Fear of upsetting him, of being alone, of losing whatever was left of our bond. I had cleaned, cooked, and given until there was nothing left of me. And still, it hadn't been enough. That realization settled in my chest like a weight, heavy but necessary. When I finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Luke's face, angry, ashamed, confused. The next morning, I found myself cleaning again. A habit my hands knew too well. The kitchen still smelled faintly of spilled beer and mustard. I wiped the counters, straightened the chairs, and threw away the half-empty cans left behind. Each motion was a small act of reclaiming my space. Around noon, the phone rang. My heart jumped before I even checked the caller ID. It was Luke. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was tight, controlled, like someone trying too hard to sound calm. He said he wanted to come over, to talk things through. Part of me hesitated, another part whispered that if I didn't face him now, I'd never break free of this cycle. I told him to come by in the afternoon. When I hung up, I sat quietly for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me. The one he used to sit in for Sunday breakfast when things were still good. He arrived with that same nervous energy he always had when he knew he was in trouble. No friends this time. No swagger. Just my son, standing at the doorway with his hands in his pockets. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding mine. He muttered that he was sorry for yesterday, that he hadn't meant for things to go so far. I told him to sit. The words came out calm, almost gentle, but there was steel under them. I asked if he understood why I had called the police. He said he did, but I could tell he didn't, not really. He saw it as an overreaction, a punishment, not as a boundary I had been forced to draw after years of being trampled. I told him this wasn't just about a sandwich or a bruise. It was about years of disrespect, of him using my home like a clubhouse, of treating me like a servant instead of a mother. He looked down, his jaw tightening. He said he was just trying to make his friends happy. That I was always too serious, too controlling. Hearing that felt like another slap. One that didn't leave a mark, but cut deeper than any shove. I stood and walked to the window, needing distance from his excuses. Outside, the yard was still littered with footprints from yesterday's chaos. The sun hit the glass, and for a moment, I saw my reflection next to his in the window, two strangers living in the same house. I told him I loved him. But love didn't mean submission. It meant teaching respect, even if it came late. He didn't answer. I could hear his breathing. Uneven. Caught between guilt and pride. Finally, he said he didn't know how to fix things. I told him the first step was to stop breaking them. He stayed quiet for a long moment, then stood up and said, "Head, call me later." As he walked out, I noticed he left his house key on the table. I didn't stop him. When the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I didn't know if this was the beginning of healing or the final distance between us. But either way, I knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Luke didn't call, and I didn't expect him to. The house felt too big, too still. But I forced myself to keep moving. I went on morning walks, talked to my neighbor for the first time in months, and even joined a small book club at the community center. Life was quiet, but it had structure again. Something I hadn't felt in years. Yet every night, when I passed Luke's empty room, a familiar ache stirred in my chest. The walls still held the echoes of his laughter. The posters he'd left behind. The trophies coated in dust. I used to clean that room every week, hoping he'd come home and see it spotless, a silent way of saying I still cared. Now, I let the dust settle. Caring didn't mean cleaning up the mess others made anymore. It meant protecting the small peace I'd earned. One afternoon, about a week later, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, two police officers stood outside again. The same ones from that day. My heart raced, thinking something had gone wrong. But they weren't here about Luke. They asked if I wanted to press formal charges for what had happened. The bruises on my arm had faded, but the memory hadn't. I hesitated, fingers tightening around the edge of the door. I told them no. Not yet. I wasn't after punishment. I was after understanding. They nodded, told me to call any time if I changed my mind, and left. I closed the door slowly and leaned against it, breathing deeply. For years, I had been invisible, but now people were finally listening. It felt strange, like stepping into sunlight after too long in the dark. Later that evening, while I was making tea, I scrolled through my phone and stumbled upon something that made my stomach twist. A short video was circulating online, grainy footage of Luke and his friends that day in the kitchen. Someone must have uploaded it. I watched in disbelief as the moment replayed. Luke grabbing my sandwich. The laughter. The fall. The silence. The caption read something like, "Mom loses it over food." The comments were divided, some cruel, some sympathetic, but all public. The world had seen what my son had done. I sat at the table, phone in hand, unable to decide if this was justice or humiliation. I didn't share it, didn't respond. But that night, for the first time, I slept without guilt. The truth was finally out there, and it didn't need my voice to defend it. The next morning, my phone rang again. It was a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, Luke's voice came through, strained and quiet. He said Head lost his job. His boss had seen the video. He sounded smaller than I remembered, broken in a way I had never heard before. I could almost see him, sitting somewhere alone, finally realizing the weight of his actions. He said he didn't know where to go. For a long time, I didn't speak. The mother in me wanted to rush to him, to fix it like I always had. But the woman I'd become, the one who had learned how to say no, spoke instead. I told him he needed to face what had done, to learn that every action carries a shadow. He didn't argue. Before hanging up, he said he understood. When the call ended, I placed the phone on the counter and stood there, feeling the ache of love and disappointment twist together. For years, I had carried him. Maybe now it was time for him to learn how to stand. 2 days later, I was watering the plants by the kitchen window when a familiar car pulled into the driveway. My heart tightened before I even saw his face. Luke stepped out slowly, his posture smaller, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes swollen from lack of sleep. He looked like the boy I used to tuck in after nightmares, not the man who had stormed my kitchen weeks ago. For a moment, I wanted to turn away and pretend I hadn't seen him. But something in the way he lingered by the gate made me open the door. He stood there silently, holding a brown paper bag. Inside were groceries, bread, milk, fruit. His voice cracked when he said he thought I might need them. I wanted to be angry, but the sight of my son trying to make things right in his own clumsy way softened me. Still, forgiveness wasn't something I could hand over like a cup of sugar. It had to be earned. I invited him in, but didn't say much. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen, mingling with the quiet tension that hung between us. Luke started to talk. Not in the defensive tone I'd grown used to, but with genuine remorse. He said, Edgy'd been thinking about everything, how Ed treated me, how his friends had laughed, how had become someone even he didn't recognize. He said losing his job had forced him to see himself clearly for the first time. His voice shook when he admitted he'd been trying to impress people who didn't truly care about him. I listened, not interrupting. I could see in his eyes that he wanted me to say it was all right, to tell him everything could go back to the way it was. But the truth was, I didn't want that old life anymore. That life had nearly erased me. I told him quietly that I appreciated his honesty, but respect was built on actions, not apologies. He nodded, looking down at his hands, calloused and restless. Then, out of nowhere, he said he had spoken to a counselor. The admission caught me off guard. Luke had never been the kind of person to ask for help. He said he wanted to change, to understand why he had treated the people who loved him so carelessly. Something in his tone was different this time, steady, humble. I could feel the sincerity radiating from him. I reached for the teapot, poured him a cup, and we sat in silence for a while. The steam rose between us like a fragile bridge. For the first time in years, it felt like we were sitting together as mother and son again, not as strangers forced to share a roof. He said he wanted to fix what was broken, not just between us, but inside himself. I told him that was a good start, and he smiled faintly. The kind of smile I hadn't seen since he was a child. After he left that afternoon, The house felt different, not empty, but lighter. I walked into the kitchen and saw the brown paper bags still on the counter. The fruit glistening under the sunlight. For years, I had filled this house with food and care, waiting for gratitude that never came. Now, he had brought something back, even if it was small. It wasn't about the groceries, it was about the gesture. I knew we weren't healed yet. Not even close. But for the first time, there was a path forward. That night, as I cleaned the counter and set the kettle for tea, I caught myself humming softly. Peace didn't come from pretending everything was fine. It came from rebuilding, one fragile day at a time. And maybe, just maybe, both of us were finally learning how to do that. The following week passed quietly. And for once, quiet didn't feel like loneliness. Luke called every few days. Never pushing. Just checking in. He talked about attending his counseling sessions. About trying to find new work. About how strange it felt to finally sit with his own mistakes. I could hear humility in his voice. But also fear, the kind of fear that comes when a person realizes they might lose the only person who truly loves them. One evening, he asked if he could come over for dinner. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to see him, but because I wanted to make sure I wasn't falling back into the same pattern. This dinner couldn't be me serving him, it had to be two adults sharing a meal. I told him he could come if he brought something to cook. He laughed softly. Said he'd handle it. And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. When he arrived that Friday, the sun was setting over the yard, painting the sky in orange and violet hues. He carried a small bag of groceries and a nervous smile. I watched as he moved around the kitchen, awkward but trying, asking where the utensils were, how long to boil the pasta. It was almost endearing, seeing him clumsy and earnest like that. At one point, he spilled a bit of sauce on the counter and froze, waiting for me to scold him. Instead, I handed him a towel and told him to clean it up himself. He did. And we both laughed, a small, honest laugh that melted the remaining ice between us. Dinner wasn't perfect, but it was warm. He asked about my book club, about my walks, about how it'd been sleeping. He was finally listening. Not out of guilt, but out of genuine care. The sound of our voices overlapping felt like music I hadn't heard in years. As we finished eating, Luke looked around the kitchen, his gaze lingering on the same counter where everything had fallen apart. He said he hadn't realized how much I had done for him until he had to do things alone. He admitted that his pride had been louder than his love, and that had taken my patience as permission to treat me badly. I felt tears welling up. But I didn't want to cry, not out of sadness, but because I knew this moment mattered. I told him that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning. He nodded. And in that moment, I saw a glimmer of the son I had raised, the boy who once believed kindness could fix anything. Maybe. Just maybe. That boy was finding his way back. After he left that night, I stood by the window, watching the taillights fade into the distance. The kitchen still smelled faintly of tomato sauce and burnt garlic. But to me, it was the sweetest scent in the world. I realized then that healing didn't happen in grand gestures or perfect apologies. It happened in the small things, the clumsy attempts, The quiet dinners. The moments when love spoke softly instead of shouting. I wiped the counter clean and turned off the lights. The same house that had witnessed my breaking was now holding my recovery. Tomorrow might bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to rest in peace. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail, something that rarely happened anymore. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. It was Luke's. Inside was a short note, written carefully, as if every word had been weighed before it touched the paper. He thanked me for giving him another chance. Said the counseling was helping him understand why Head carried so much anger and entitlement, and that he was finally learning what respect really meant. At the bottom, he had written one last line that stayed with me all day. I want to make you proud again, Mom. I sat by the window for a long time, holding that letter in my hands. The paper was warm from the sun, and I thought about how words could heal in ways apologies never could. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was honesty. And that was enough to make me believe he was truly changing. The following weekend, Luke came over again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood two of his friends, the same ones who had been in my kitchen that awful day. They looked uneasy, shifting their weight, eyes avoiding mine. Luke said they wanted to apologize in person. My first instinct was to close the door, but I saw how nervous they were, how much effort it must have taken to show up. I stepped aside and let them in. They stood there awkwardly, and one of them said they were sorry for what had happened, that they hadn't realized how cruel their behavior had been. The other added that seeing the video online had made them ashamed. I watched them speak, noticing how the bravado they once wore like armor had melted away. They weren't here to justify themselves. They were here to face what they had done. I accepted their apology, not because I wanted to make them feel better, but because I wanted to close that chapter for good. After they left, Luke stayed behind to help me clean up. We didn't say much, but the silence was easy, comfortable even. At one point, he glanced at me and said, "Head found a new job." It wasn't glamorous warehouse work, but it was honest. And he was proud of it. I could see the spark of purpose in his eyes again. I told him that pride wasn't in the job title. It was in how a person carried themselves. He smiled faintly and said he finally understood what that meant. Before leaving, he hugged me. Not the quick, distracted kind of hug he used to give, but one that lingered just long enough to remind me that forgiveness was worth the effort. As he walked out, I felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through me, a cautious kind of hope. That night, I found myself back in the kitchen, the same place where everything had fallen apart, but it no longer felt haunted. I brewed tea and watched the steam curl upward, soft and slow, like peace returning after a storm. I thought about how people always say love means never giving up, but that's not true. Sometimes, love means stepping back, letting someone face the consequences, and waiting patiently for them to find their way home. It took a sandwich, a bruise, and a painful lesson for both of us to learn that respect is not demanded, it's earned. The clock ticked softly, marking the rhythm of a quiet house that no longer carried the weight of unspoken resentment. For the first time, I was no longer surviving inside these walls. I was living again. Winter came early that year. The mornings were cold enough to fog the windows, and the sound of wind against the roof became my daily companion. I spent most of my days reading, tending to my small garden, and writing in a notebook, a habit I'd picked up during the months of silence after the fight. It helped me make sense of the pieces that had once felt too scattered to name. One morning, as I was journaling, I wrote a sentence that made me pause. Healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means remembering without anger. I stared at the words, realizing they described exactly where I was. The hurt was still there, but it no longer owned me. Around noon, Luke called to say he wanted to visit with something important to share. His voice sounded lighter than before, almost excited. I told him to come by later, and as I hung up, I couldn't help but smile. It had been a long road, but maybe this was the moment when everything would finally settle into peace. When Luke arrived that evening, he looked different. Not just cleaner or calmer, but more grounded. He was carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to me without saying a word. Just a hopeful look in his eyes. Inside was a framed photo, an old one I hadn't seen in years. It was of him and his father, taken at a picnic when Luke was about 10. I could still remember that day. The smell of grilled corn, the sound of laughter, the way his father had lifted him onto his shoulders. Under the picture, Luke had added a small inscription. To the woman who never stopped trying, even when I didn't deserve it. I traced the words with my finger, my throat tightening. It wasn't about the photo, it was about the man my son was becoming. Someone who finally understood gratitude. We sat down for dinner. Something simple, chicken soup and bread. Luke talked about work. About how he'd started volunteering at the same community center where I went for book club. He said helping others had given him perspective. That it reminded him of everything he had taken for granted. I listened. Proud, but careful not to let emotions spill too easily. He asked if I ever thought we could go back to how things were. I told him gently that I didn't want to go back, I wanted us to move forward. The past had lessons, not homes. He nodded. And for the first time, I saw peace in his expression instead of guilt. There was nothing left to prove. Nothing left to defend. Just two people, finally meeting each other in truth. After he left, I placed the framed photo on the mantel above the fireplace. The flickering light caught the glass, and for a brief moment, it looked like the three of us, me, Luke, and the memory of his father were together again. I realized then that family wasn't about perfection or constant harmony. It was about surviving the storms, forgiving the breaks, and building new bridges from old ruins. I sat by the fire until it dimmed. The sound of crackling wood, echoing softly in the quiet room. Tomorrow would come with its own noise and worry. But tonight, I had something stronger than either of those, peace built from pain. Respect born from confrontation. And love that had finally learned how to breathe. Spring came with a softness that felt like mercy. The garden bloomed again, roses by the fence, small daisies by the porch, and the tall oak tree at the back, sprouting bright new leaves. I spent my mornings outside with a cup of tea, watching sunlight dance across the yard that once echoed with shouting. The house felt alive again. Not because it was full of people, but because it was full of calm. Luke visited often, always calling first, never assuming. He helped me repair the old swing, painted the fence, and sometimes stayed for dinner. There was no tension, no pretending, just quiet understanding. Each visit felt like another thread mended in a fabric we had torn apart. Sometimes, I caught myself watching him when he wasn't looking, studying how much he had changed. His eyes were clearer now, his movements slower, more deliberate. I realized he had finally grown into the man his father would have been proud of. One Sunday afternoon, we sat together in the garden. To the sky, a pale blue dome overhead. Luke told me he had been offered a better job at the warehouse supervisor this time. He said he wanted to save up for a small apartment, to start over properly. I could see the mixture of excitement and fear on his face. That look of someone about to step into a life of their own. I told him it was a good plan, that every new beginning needs space to breathe. He smiled, then hesitated before adding that he was thinking about moving a bit farther away, maybe even to another city. My heart sank for a second, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I told him I was proud of him, that growth always meant distance in some form. He promised to visit, to call, to never disappear again. I nodded, knowing that promises are fragile things, but hoping this one would hold. After he left that evening, I walked back into the kitchen, the same place where our story had cracked open months ago. The sunlight touched the counter where the sandwich had once fallen, and I caught myself smiling at the memory. It no longer stung. That moment, as awful as it was, had been the spark that set everything in motion. Without it, we would still be stuck, him trapped in arrogance, me trapped in silence. Life has strange ways of teaching lessons. Sometimes, the worst moment of your life is the doorway to peace. I leaned against the counter, feeling the smooth wood under my hand, and whispered a quiet thank you, not to anyone in particular, just to the universe for giving me the strength to finally stand up. That night, I sat by the window with my notebook and wrote a single line across the page. Love isn't about how much you give, it's about what you refuse to lose. I closed the book and placed it beside the framed photo of Luke and his father. The two of them seemed to smile at me through the glass. I realized that maybe, after everything, this was what healing truly meant. Not erasing the past, but learning to live beside it peacefully. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was full of echoes that no longer hurt, memories that no longer burned, and a future that finally felt possible. For the first time, I didn't dread the next chapter. I was ready to live it. Summer arrived with long days and slow mornings. The sunlight poured through the windows like honey, warming the corners of the house that used to feel cold and heavy. I had started volunteering at the same community center where Luke worked part-time before his promotion. It felt strange at first, walking into a place where my son was known not as the man who once hurt his mother, but as someone dependable and kind. People spoke of him with respect, telling me how hard he worked and how he always stayed late to help others. I would just smile, hiding the quiet pride that grew in my chest. Life had come full circle in a way I never expected. The woman who once felt small inside her own home now stood tall among strangers. finding her voice again, one story. One act of kindness at a time. One afternoon, the director of the center asked if I could help organize a charity dinner. I hesitated, remembering how the word dinner used to fill me with anxiety. But this time, it was different. There was no one ordering me around. No one taking credit for my effort. It was my choice. I agreed. And over the next few days, I found myself planning menus, arranging tables, and laughing with the volunteers. It was work. Yes. But it was joyful work. On the night of the event, Luke showed up unannounced, dressed neatly, helping to serve food. When our eyes met across the room, something in me softened. The last time we had been in a kitchen together, it had ended in chaos. Now, we were working side by side for a good cause. The symmetry of it almost made me tear up. After the event, as we packed up, Luke sat next to me on the steps outside the hall. The night air was warm, filled with the chirping of crickets. He said quietly that watching me lead that night reminded him of who I truly was: strong, calm, and unshakable. I laughed softly, saying I was just doing my part. But he shook his head and said, "I'd done more than that." He told me that every bit of discipline and compassion he now had came from me. Even the parts he had once resisted. Hearing that was like balm on an old wound. For years, I had wondered if all my sacrifices had meant anything. In that moment, I finally had my answer. We sat in silence after that. Content. The kind of peace that doesn't need words. When I got home that night, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood in the quiet kitchen, feeling the cool tile beneath my feet, the faint scent of summer air drifting through the open window. I thought about how far we had come from that first moment of pain to this quiet reconciliation. Life had not turned out perfect, but maybe it was never meant to be. Perfection was sterile. Growth was messy. And yet, here we were, standing in the middle of something real. I looked around the room and realized it wasn't just my house anymore, it was my sanctuary. Not because it was silent, but because it was finally safe. I poured myself a glass of water, raised it slightly toward the empty space beside me, and whispered, "We did it." A few weeks later, I received an invitation that caught me off guard. It was from Luke, written neatly in blue ink, asking me to come to his new apartment for dinner. The words were simple, but I could feel the meaning behind them. For years, I had been the one who cooked, cleaned, and hosted, always making space for him. Now, he wanted to return that gesture. I smiled as I read the note and felt a quiet warmth bloom inside me. It wasn't just about dinner, it was about balance. About him finally understanding what it meant to give as well as receive. On the day of the invitation, I took the bus into the city, holding a small bouquet of flowers I'd picked from my garden. The ride was long, but the view outside the window made me peaceful. The world looked lighter when you weren't carrying guilt on your back. When I arrived, Luke was waiting by the door, looking a little nervous but proud. His apartment was small but tidy. The kind of space someone cares for themselves. The smell of food drifted from the kitchen pasta, I think, though there was a hint of something burnt in the air. He laughed when I teased him about it, saying he was still learning. We sat down to eat. And it wasn't perfect, the sauce was too thick, and the bread slightly overdone, but it was one of the best meals I'd ever had. Not because of the taste, but because of what it meant. Every forkful felt like another piece of our relationship being rebuilt. One small bite at a time. We talked about everything: his work, my volunteer group, even funny little stories from when he was a kid. For the first time in years, the conversation flowed easily, without tension or guarded pauses. After dinner, he brought out an old wooden box. Inside were keepsakes from his childhood drawings, baseball cards, and an old photo of me holding him as a baby. He said he'd kept it all these years, even through the worst times, and that now he wanted me to have it. I traced the photo with my thumb, my eyes misting. He said softly that he had finally realized something important, that love wasn't about fixing others, but about standing beside them when they choose to fix themselves. His words lingered in the air, gentle but true. I told him he had grown into someone his father would have been proud of. And for once, he didn't look away. He smiled, shy but genuine, and said he hoped I was proud too. I was. More than I could ever say aloud. As I rode the bus home that night, the city lights flickered through the window like slow-moving stars. I leaned my head against the glass and thought about how strange time was, how it could turn pain into peace if you let it. The road we had taken wasn't easy. It was jagged and messy and real. But we had walked it together, one step at a time. The house was dark when I got back, but it didn't feel empty. It felt whole. I placed the box on the coffee table and sat beside it, feeling the weight of all those memories, some painful, most precious. For years, I had been afraid that love was something that could be broken forever. But now I knew better. Love bends. Love bruises. But, when tended to, it grows back stronger. The following morning, sunlight spilled across the floor in soft golden lines. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the wooden box Luke had given me. Inside were pieces of our story, the little drawings he made when he was 5. The birthday card had written in crooked letters. A photo of his father holding him high in the air. I ran my fingers across each item, feeling the years in their edges. The memories no longer hurt. They hummed quietly. Like a song, I finally remembered the lyrics to. I realized how much I had changed since that awful day. Back then, I had been angry, exhausted, and scared. Now, I was steady, calm, and strong. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had learned how to protect my peace. I didn't need to be needed to feel valuable anymore. That was freedom, the kind I had never known as a mother who always put herself last. Later that day, I got a call from Luke. His voice was lighter, full of the energy of someone rebuilding their life with both hands. He told me about a promotion he was up for and how had started saving money for the future. Then he hesitated and said there was something else. He had been mentoring a few younger workers at his job, helping them stay on track. And one of them had told him he reminded them of their mom. He said it made him think of me and how much patience it must have taken to raise him. His tone grew quiet, thoughtful. He said he never really saw me back then. That had been too wrapped up in his own frustration to notice the sacrifices I made. But now he did. Every word was soft but heavy. Like a stone finally being set down after years of carrying it. I felt tears forming. But I let them fall. Some tears aren't from sadness. They're from release. That afternoon, I walked outside to the garden. The air was warm, and the smell of fresh earth wrapped around me. The roses were blooming again. Their petals the same deep red as they'd been when Luke was small and used to bring me handfuls of them as apologies for breaking something. I picked one gently and placed it in a small vase by the window. Life had broken us once, but we had rebuilt it deliberately, quietly, and stronger than before. I whispered a thank you to the wind, to time, to the part of me that refused to give up even when everything hurt. Forgiveness hadn't erased the past, but it had rewritten the ending. That night, before going to bed, I opened my journal and wrote a few lines. We can't change how love begins, but we can choose how it survives. Sometimes it grows through kindness, sometimes through distance, and sometimes through the courage to say enough. I closed the notebook and placed it beside the photo of Luke and his father. The picture no longer looked like a memory, it looked like a promise kept. Tomorrow would come, as it always did. But now I was no longer afraid of it. My story wasn't one of loss anymore. It was one of learning, of reclaiming, of becoming whole after being broken. I turned off the lamp, letting the room fill with quiet. Peace wasn't loud. It whispered. And that night, it whispered to me. The last chapter of this story began on an ordinary morning, quiet and bright. The kind that doesn't announce its importance. I woke early, made tea, and stood by the window watching the first light slip over the garden. The world outside felt clean, washed of the heaviness that used to linger here. I thought about the months that had passed the police report, the silence, the letters, the dinners, the rebuilding, and realized how far we'd both come. There was a time when I believed that confrontation would destroy my family, that standing up for myself meant losing my son forever. But what it really did was set us free. Sometimes love can't grow in silence. It needs boundaries to breathe. That was the hardest lesson, but also the truest one. I had found my voice, and in doing so, I had helped my son find his. Later that week, Luke came to visit again. He looked different, confident, calm, settled. We sat on the porch, the afternoon breeze carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden. He told me about the people he was helping at work, about how heads started speaking at meetings, mentoring younger employees. He said he wanted to teach them what he had learned the hard way, that respect is a choice, not a demand. I listened with quiet pride, my heart swelling with every word. Then he said something that stayed with me long after he left. He said that the day I called the police wasn't the day he lost his mother, it was the day he finally met her. It took me a moment to breathe after that. The truth of it hit deep. For so long, I had thought that standing up for myself would make me the villain in his story. But it had made me human. And in being human, I had taught him how to be one too. As evening settled, In. We shared one last dinner together before he moved into his new apartment across town. The meal was simple grilled fish, roasted vegetables, and a small lemon pie I'd baked. It wasn't the food that made it special. It was the silence between us, comfortable and full. There were no more unspoken words. No more guilt waiting at the table. Just love, steady, real, quiet. When he stood to leave, he hugged me tightly, and I felt the same warmth I used to feel when he was a little boy falling asleep in my arms. He said he'd call soon, and I knew he would. As the door closed behind him, I realized that this was the peace I had been waiting for, not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that blooms after forgiveness. Later that night, I sat in the garden with the stars overhead, the sound of crickets humming in the dark. I thought about everything: the sandwich, the shouting, the heartbreak, and the healing. Life had come full circle, but not back to where it began. It had taken us somewhere better. I finally understood that sometimes it takes losing control to regain yourself. And sometimes the people who hurt you are the ones who teach you how to rise. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill my lungs. The past was behind me. The future was open. And for the first time, I didn't need to look for happiness. It was already here, sitting quietly beside me. I looked toward the house, my home, my sanctuary, and whispered softly to the night sky, "I made it."